Hey guys, and welcome back to another Woodbrew video.
In this week's video, we're building this sort of cycling desk. I've been training for a half Ironman and I've been spending a lot of time indoors on the cycling trainer, and I don't really have a good way to set my laptop up or anything that I use to sort of track what I'm doing on the bike or just for entertainment like watching Netflix while I'm on the bike. So in this week's video, we kind of solved the problem of not having to buy a like $200 specifically made cycling desk and built our own. So without further ado, let's get started. We decided to use a bunch of scrap 3/4 inch plywood we had laying around. So the first thing we're doing is sort of cutting these to a rough length that will give us some smaller pieces that are easier to manage and are roughly the same size as the pieces that we need. So I had a bunch of these strips left over from the last project we did and a couple of these older pieces that were also from a previous project. And then I'm going to take them over to the table saw and rip them down to their final widths. This project really only has 2 widths of boards and then one big long top, and just the lengths are different. Even the angles are entirely the same. Because I'm not really sure what the ends of these were and if they were cut perfectly straight or not, I'm just stacking a bunch of them together and cutting the ends off so that we have some very good starting material. There are 2 of almost every single board in this project, basically a bunch of pairs, so I'm cutting all of these kind of together, and there's even one stack of about 4 that are exactly the same. The plans do a nice job of laying these out, but I'm also making sure that I mark each individual board as to what it is on the plans, because some of them are very similar and you want to make sure that you do still differentiate them. Many of the boards are getting an angle cut on them, and a lot of the angles are parallel, meaning that the long point is going to be on opposite sides of the board. So when you go to measure the length of the board, it makes it kind of difficult. So it's really nice to use an angle guide of some sort to make sure that you make a line that's perfect before you actually cut the angle. Many of the boards are also getting a round over, and we actually tried out these guides that Rockler makes, and I'll leave a link to them in the description below. We've had these laying around our shop for a long time, decided to try them out. Our boards are really small, so we had to clamp them to another scrap board. But honestly, I don't know what I've been doing using a jigsaw in the past. This made it so much easier, and everything was super nice and consistent and required very little sanding. So if you have to do a lot of roundovers in a project, I'd recommend checking one of these jigs out. With all the pieces cut, it's now time to make the long groove that goes down the length of the side pieces, and this is where kind of the bolts are going to ride in and what's going to allow the sink to be adjustable. So only the outside arm is getting this groove in it, and there's a number of ways that you could approach cutting this groove out, but I decided to use a router because I have one. If you don't have a router, I would recommend using a table saw to do this, or if you don't have a table saw, then you could use a skill saw, but that would be relatively difficult. So I would maybe try to find a friend who has one of these 2 tools, and you don't have to have a router table. You could do this by hand with the router facing down. There are also several holes that we need to drill in pretty precise locations, and these are going to be for the bolts and for the dowel. Now initially I was just going to have 1 bolt and 1 dowel, but come to find out when you start adjusting it up even higher, you really need that second bolt to kind of lock everything down. So honestly, you don't actually need the dowel. I think you could just do 2 bolts. So in the plans, I'm going to make that change to where you only use 2 of the bolts instead of the dowel and 1 bolt. We cut the top of the desk out of another scrap piece of 3/4 inch plywood, and then I drew in this sort of rectangle area here that I want to router out, and this is where I'm going to be able to sit my phone or iPad in, and it's going to keep it upright. Again, the router table makes this such an easy process, but if you don't have a router table, you could use many other things for this one. You could actually use a skill saw and a chisel, because this isn't super precise, but again, it helps a lot to have a router, and you don't have to do this one with a router table. In fact, it'd probably be easier to do this one by hand using a guide than it would be face down like this. Now it's time for assembly, and a lot of the stuff is just going to get glue and pin nails, and then the larger joints are actually going to get a screw in them as well. But for a lot of this, it's just glue and pin nails. With that one done, I'm just going to leave it in clamps to dry while I start working on the other side. We will repeat the same exact process for what is the top. It's basically just a smaller version, and this one has the groove in it. With all of the pieces dry, we went ahead and started connecting the two halves together. Now we actually should have just put this piece together and let it dry beforehand, but we ended up just go ahead and screwing it in and letting it dry overnight. So basically just stacking two pieces of 3/4 inch plywood there to make a more stiffer piece. And then we're just going to use some screws through the side here to connect the two larger base pieces together. With that done, we're going to do the same exact process for the top, except for this is only going to be using 1 3/4 inch piece on each end. This is how the top is going to get connected. We didn't have a secondary piece on the bottom because we don't want the bike tire to hit it. Then we're just going to set the top in place and screw it down. Our dowels were just a little too big, so here's a quick tip to kind of sand them down very fast. Now we're putting the dowel in, and the idea behind this is that it rides inside that groove so that when you loosen one of the bolts, the thing doesn't just spin and flop around. Again, later we added a second bolt, and basically this dowel becomes useless at that point. We're running into some sort of stiffness problems, so I ended up adding in this piece here that wasn't initially in the design, but actually kind of makes it look better and definitely helps stiffen it up. It's basically just another 3/4 inch piece of plywood here. I cut one side on that same angle, and then I cut out that shape using a miter saw and a jigsaw. And that just kind of gives a nice little spot for the tire to go all the way to the back if it needs to. And with that, it's time to just apply some finish. We're just using the standard Halcyon Total Boat finish that we've been using for a while now and spraying it on with the sprayer. Both of those products are linked down in the description if you're interested in checking them out. Been using them for a while and really enjoy them. We're also adding some very small casters to the bottom of just the front. That way you can just lift up the back, which is the part that will be in front of you, and you can kind of drag it towards you or push it away if you need to. And you can see how we just have to bend those little sections on the inside to make them go over the now non-existent dowels that kind of don't have a purpose. And we're using some of these star knobs that we had laying around and 1/4-inch bolts. And there you go, it's complete, and I've really been enjoying this. It makes this whole process of training so much nicer and more enjoyable when you're just staring endlessly at a wall. So if you guys really enjoyed this video, please leave us a comment down below if you'd like to see more of these sort of training, like more personal lifestyle, very specific projects like this. And if you are super interested in building it, I do have a set of plans below, so be sure to check those out as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you next week.